In this presentation, I'm going to talk about how to make your presentations accessible. This will cover everything from presenting on the day of and creating slides that are presentable. Perhaps the most important thing I will tell you during this presentation is to please use the microphone. This is a little bit different when you're talking about a virtual presentation, but I think it still bears mentioning. Though many presenters think that they are loud enough without a microphone or without a specialized microphone if they are using their computer, attendees who are hard of hearing or who may be interpreting your presentation for attendees who are hard of hearing or deaf may struggle to hear. So please be sure to always have a specialized microphone ready to go for your presentation. And this can be as simple as sort of a headphones and built-in microphone set, just so long as you have some microphone that's close to your mouth. And always be sure to be speaking into that microphone so that you're not turning away from it as you're doing your presentation. If you are talking about in-person presentations and there are microphones for those asking questions, be sure to ask those people to also use their microphone when they're speaking. And if they don't, or in a virtual presentation, if you have a typed question, be sure to repeat the question into the microphone before answering it, as this will help people who may not have access to the chat. Okay, so getting started with actually creating your presentations. There's actually sort of a step 0 that I didn't include a slide for, but I want to mention quickly, which is consider what tools you're using to create your presentations. So some tools such as Google Slides and PowerPoint have a lot of built-in accessibility features, but a lot of the more fancy and particularly more animated tools that are out there on the internet for creating presentations may not have all of these features built in. So when you're evaluating what tools to use in creating a presentation, be sure to consider whether or not they have accessibility options built in and whether or not they have documentation saying how accessible the tool is. That's something you can usually find pretty easily in their Q&A section, frequently asked questions section, or just by Googling their name and accessibility. You'll see reviews of them. Today I'm basically going to be covering two of the more dominant options, which are sort of the Microsoft option, which is PowerPoint, or also Google Slides. Both of these have a lot of features that do allow you to make your presentations accessible. That's part of the reason why I'm choosing to focus on them. Part of it's just what I have access to. So this isn't to say that they're the only options, but just to say that you do want to think about accessibility if you're going to pick another option. Also, a quick note that I'm going to try to show how to do things in a few different versions of Microsoft where it's changed significantly. But if you do run into any problems because you have a different version of PowerPoint, that's something that's actually pretty easy to find information about on the web. That Microsoft does a really nice job of having documentation out there. So, let's talk about setting up your document once you've started to create a presentation. You want to be sure that you can set the language of your presentation. To ensure that screen readers can read your presentation, it's really important to do this. In many versions of PowerPoint, this can be found in the Tools menu under Language. In the version of PowerPoint available in Microsoft Office 2019, this option is available in the File menu under the Options section. In Google Slides, the same option can be found in the File menu as well using these steps here. And the reason why this is important is because setting your file language will really help to ensure that any assistive devices that someone's using, particularly screen readers, will be able to know what language it's in and therefore pronounce the words properly. If you do need to include multiple languages, you can indicate that in the language selection for that section of text alone often. Or you can say at the beginning of the slide or in the notes field of the slide something about the fact that you're switching languages. Next, you want to be sure that you're building a strong structure into your slides. A lot of times I think this might be something that's overlooked, but most slide creation tools do offer an option that you may have never even noticed before to edit your styles at the master slide level rather than making changes to each slide. By editing the master slide, you can set a consistent style, which will make your slides more readable to just everyone, really, and that makes them more accessible and comprehensible for all members of the audience. It really gives you clear visual cues about how the information fits together and really sets the style that will be something that gives visual cues to people to understand your information throughout. As you're building a strong structure, you also want to think about hierarchy of information. And What that really means is that you want to consider a consistent hierarchy of font size, and that's going to make your slides easy to parse visually and easier to understand. Generally speaking, higher level text should be larger, and you do want to make sure that no text should be used that is smaller than 24 to 28 points when you're going to be presenting on a screen. Now, since we're going to be talking primarily today about core forum, that really is going to be a little bit of a different situation because you're going to be on everyone's individual computers since it's a virtual conference, but I would still encourage you to try to keep your text relatively large. So maybe 18-point font would be okay at the very smallest, since most people are going to be viewing it on their own personal computer. But even still, you want to make sure that it's sort of larger than what you might think is necessary, just to make sure that it's accessible to everybody. You also want to build a strong structure in terms of order. So right here I'm showing the latest version of Microsoft Office, and you'll see that this is under Arrange, and you have to go to the Selection pane. And once you go to the Selection pane, that's going to let you move things up and down in the order. I think this makes it a little bit harder to understand maybe what I'm talking about in terms of order than the next slide we're going to see. The next slide is going to show you what this looks like in the previous version of Microsoft Office, where it gave you more of a visual representation where you would reorder things again under the range menu by dragging things back and forth. But basically what this does is that it gives you the order in which they're going to be read by the screen reader. So you probably aren't necessarily thinking about this when you add content to your screen, but going back again for a moment to what it looks like in the more modern versions of Microsoft Office, you'll see that it is going to read these things in this particular order, whether that's what you intended or not. And the order that it's read in before you reorder things is really based on the order generally in which you created things or laid them out on the screen. And that might have nothing to do with the order that you would want someone to get that information read to them. So when you're reordering things on your screen, you really want to be thinking, what order would it make sense for people to be presented with this information? So you probably want the title for your slide, if there is one, to come first. Then you may want to have, a specific piece of information told to them before another piece of information. So that just means that you drag it to the top of the list, or in the case of this, you drag it further towards the front of this list of pieces. And you'll see that in the older versions of Microsoft, they numbered it, which is part of what was helpful. This is really something that people don't necessarily think to do, but it is important because this is going to have probably the most impact on access in terms of making sure that your slide is read to people in a order that makes sense. Unfortunately, it's also the feature that varies the most between tools in my experience. So you may have to do a little bit of poking around if you're not using one of these versions. But it's really worth checking out. And it's really worth making sure you fully understand what order something is being read in. Another thing I would definitely recommend is using the accessibility checkers. Some tools, especially those from Microsoft and Adobe, have these built into them. While they won't find every issue, it is worth always trying to use these if they are available. And remember that if you redo your slides or add a quick edit, it's worth checking again to make sure that all your latest edits work as well. So now let's talk about sort of how you style your presentations. First of all, choosing your font is very important and can have a big impact on accessibility. So some do's and don'ts. Do use large font. As I mentioned before, try not to go less than 28 points if you're going to be presenting in front of a crowd. And in a case where you're going to be presenting on a screen, still try to stay as large as possible and probably not below 18 or maybe even a little bit higher. Avoid fancy fonts and multiple styles. So if there's a quirky font that you really like, keep in mind that that may not be very accessible to some people. And that can present issues for people who have different types of disabilities, but depending on what type of font it is, it can present issues for other people as well. So for example, if you choose a font that's fancy, handwriting style cursive, keep in mind that that's something that people are probably going to be reading much slower than they would be if you picked a plain font. And I think one thing to always keep in mind when you're thinking about these types of things is that your slides should always build on what you're saying, not distract from it. So if you're using a font that is so fancy that it's going to take a while for people to read it, that's really more of a distraction than something that's building on what you're saying. And have a clear hierarchy of font sizes so that you're not suddenly having information that is less important that's much larger. Because visually, we just naturally tend to think that, okay, the large information is more important. In terms of don'ts, don't fill your slides with a lot of fine print. I know sometimes we might want to have a large quotation. I definitely do it as well. You might want to have something else that is, just some details that you put at the bottom, but this can be very visually confusing. So try very hard to avoid that sort of fine print that requires people to do a lot of reading. Again, that's going to be something that really prevents them from listening fully to what you have to say. Don't use font color as the only means of conveying information. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But just for those people who may have difficulty perceiving color, and also because on different devices, color is going to show up differently, it's really good not to convey information solely through color. And be sure not to choose a font color that blends in or doesn't have enough contrast with the background that you've selected. So that leads nicely into contrast. So you really do want to think carefully about contrast. Contrast is an accessibility issue, but it's one of these accessibility issues that I think is a really good example of how accessibility can really impact those who don't consider themselves to have a disability as well. Because there's a lot of people who may have trouble seeing things that are low contrast. This can be everything from how bright their screen is, to how bright the room around them is, to also people who are aging often just naturally have a little bit of a harder time seeing things that are low contrast. So you really want your contrast to pop. You want it to be something where there's a really noticeably high contrast between the front and the back. There are tools, and I'll have a link to one at the end of these slides, that are going to give you the ability to check your contrast. But honestly, I don't necessarily think that that's even advisable in a presentation, because I don't think you should be so close to the border of accessible or not accessible that you need an accessibility contrast checker. You really just want to err on the side of having very high contrast, in my opinion. So now we're going to talk a little bit more what I already alluded to about whether or not you're relying on color to convey information. So if you look at these two slides, you'll see that the one on the left is going to convey the information that's necessary, both with color and with texture, and by having the information right by the line that it's with. I think some people might glance at it and think that it looks a little bit more busy, but if you think about it, what it's doing is that somebody who's unable to perceive color, or if this was reproduced, like printed out and appearing in a black and white format, you can still completely understand the information that's being conveyed, even if you took these colors away completely. And that's really what you should be aiming for. Now, I would also point out that because of this, in part, and also just because of accessibility more generally, the graph on the left is a little bit larger than the one on the right. And that's another subtle accessibility point that's separate from color, but I would say err on the side of making things a little bit larger, and err on the side of making sure that you're not conveying information solely through the use of color, because that really will exclude some people from being able to understand what you're telling them. So now let's talk about adding alt text to images. Alt text is vital to slide accessibility. If you don't include alt, also known as alternative text, on every image, this image will either be invisible to screen readers, or it will be read as simply whatever the name of the file for the image is. So for example, chart.jpg, which is obviously not helpful to someone using a screen reader or other assistive device. To add alt text in PowerPoint, you'll see that you're clicking on the menu here, and you're just sort of scrolling down until it says edit alt text. This is again in the more recent versions of PowerPoint, and it'll pop up on the right with this box for you to write a description. Now, the one exception to when you need to do alt text is if the image is purely decorative. So a good example of this is on my first slide, I had a background image that was just a vase and a computer screen, and then I had the title of my presentation as if it was written on the computer screen. But that really wasn't conveying any additional information. So in that case, you would consider the image purely decorative, and you could check this box that you see at the bottom where you say mark as decorative. Now, you'll also see that there's a button here in later versions of PowerPoint to generate a description for you. You are welcome to try that out, but I would never use it solely without checking it, because these sorts of tools are available in an increasing number of places, including things like Facebook. And frankly, while they are impressive that we're able to do any of it, they're often not super accurate. And certainly they're not necessarily going to cover everything you might want to cover about the image if you were writing a description yourself. So I would recommend that you check any auto created content that you might be putting into your presentation in alt text, but it is something that if you want to give it a whirl, you can see how it works. In Google Slides, you do this by right-clicking and then going down to the alt text option. And that's also found in the format menu. The pop-up screen gives you an option for a title. The title is sort of where you would put the short description that's automatically read, and then the description field is where you would put longer content. This is something that's worth thinking about, because if you do have something complicated, such as a chart or a graph or a lot of data that you're presenting as an image, you may want to put additional details that you don't put in the alt text itself in the description field where that's available. If the presentation creation tool that you're using doesn't have a description field, another option for that is to put a note about where they might be able to find that additional information elsewhere. You don't necessarily want to put a huge amount of information in just the alt text itself, because there's no way for that information to be partially read clearly. So basically, once somebody starts reading it, they're not going to know when they would want to stop reading it. So they're going to go through probably most, if not the entire alt tag. So you want to keep your alt tags relatively short, as few words as possible. And you really just want to focus in on that information when you're writing your alt text. Anything that's more involved, you can either put in the description field or just note where they can find, how they can get that additional information from you. So now I want to talk a little bit about captions and audio description. So when you're captioning video content, you really want to be thinking about the fact that you want to caption everything. So you want to have everything you might say, so like the script of what you're going to say, but you also want to caption any important sounds that are happening as well. That's sort of the difference between subtitles and captions, is that with captions, you're going to include in brackets or parentheses additional information about important sounds that are happening on the screen. If you're going to be integrating recorded content into your presentation, you should have pre-captioned that content and have the captions on when you're showing it to make everything more accessible to your users. You also want to use auto caption tools in any video conferencing tools that you're using. So for example, Zoom with certain types of subscriptions offers the option to have auto captions turned on. If you don't have someone who's able to do live captioning or interpretation, you really want to turn that on. It's not as accurate as we would want it to be ideally, but it's better than nothing. You want to make sure that your captions are readable. So when you're thinking about where the captions appear on the video, make sure that you don't have a lot of text that appears on the video in that space as well. Try not to cover them with other features. So in some video conferencing tools, they might end up covered by the chat feature or other features, so you want to make sure that that's not happening. You want to make sure that there's sufficient contrast, and again, if you can set this in the tool that you're using, you want to make sure that the font size is adequate. And then if you're going to be showing a video, I would also encourage you to consider doing intro for that video that tells someone who isn't able to see the video what happens in it, or do audio description for the visual content. And audio description is basically a field that people can have, sort of like captions, except it explains what's visually happening on the screen. A quick word about automated captions. Some tools, such as Google Slides, do offer automated captions. In fact, PowerPoint, also in the later versions, has a feature like this that's even more fully featured, because it actually can translate things for you automatically as well. And if you have access to these tools and you don't have another way of captioning or interpreting the presentation, I think it's worth turning them on. Much like the other auto-created things that I've talked about during this presentation, it isn't as good as maybe something that was created by an actual person, but it is something that is better than nothing, I would say. So now let's sort of just talk about more general things. So in general, the advice I would give is just keep it simple. Whether we're talking about videos that you're creating or we're talking about presentation slides, avoid densely packed text or visuals that are going to be distracting, difficult to understand or parse, and really just distract from you speaking. Don't use distracting animations or transitions. They can work in some cases, but depending on what types of transitions you're using, some people may find them very visually difficult to look at. They might be really, even give people motion sickness in extreme situations. So think about that, and again, think about making sure that your presentation is adding to what you're saying and not distracting from it. Make sure your text is on the screen long enough to be read. If you want to say something to people and not have them read it, then don't put it on the screen. But if you're going to put it on the screen, you should assume that people are going to read it, and maybe even give enough of a pause for people to scan through what you're saying, what you've written, before you start speaking when you put up each new slide. Give your audience a chance to consider complicated content before you speak. So this sort of goes back to what I was saying about a moment ago about putting text on the screen and giving people time to read it. But also, particularly if you're going to put like a data visualization on the screen, wait a minute before you start explaining it. Just give people a chance to look at it, because otherwise they may not truly be listening to what you're saying. Explain all acronyms, jargon, and idioms. And really, don't assume that just because somebody's part of the profession, they'll know what this is. That's very exclusionary in a lot of different ways. They might be in a different specialty. They might be new to the profession. They may have just always worked with people who avoid acronyms and jargon and idioms for accessibility reasons. So make sure that you're explaining any of this as you use it so that you're keeping the audience with you and making it understandable for everyone. And when it comes to responding to questions, think about how you do that in a way to make it accessible as well. I think it works well, if possible, to answer questions throughout, because then you're able to really connect it back to the topic that's happening when the person has the question. Allow for written or typed questions if at all possible. I encourage this even in an in-person setting, but I think that one of the nice things about doing virtual presentations is that this is a little bit easier. But make sure that you're really allowing people to write down their questions so that they don't have to feel like they have to speak in front of a large group. Repeat any questions into the microphone, especially if they are included in something like a chat feature. And offer ways for people to follow up with you at a later date after they've had a chance to ponder, or when they are not interested in presenting their question in front of a large group because they feel like it might appear foolish. I would recommend sharing your slides if at all possible. That's a great way to make sure that the experience is more accessible for people. Best of all is if you can share your slides before your session. That allows people who do use assistive tools to go through them in advance. If you are going to share your slides, be sure to give them a clear, descriptive file name. And part of giving a clear file name is making sure that you capitalize each word in the file name so that it's not just going to be read as a string of letters, but instead, if each word of the file name is capitalized, then screen readers will be able to more clearly read that. Offer multiple file formats for maximum flexibility so that people can select which one works best for them. And in particular, if you're going to offer PDFs, make sure that they're accessible, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And consider the accessibility of any other shared files, such as handouts or code files or data files. I've been focusing on how to make your slides accessible, but anything that you're going to share really needs to be made accessible. Okay, so now I've mentioned PDFs. Let's talk about PDF accessibility for just a moment. So with PDFs, accessibility means more than just OCR or making the text readable. It also means tagging the content in Acrobat and checking the accessibility with a screen reader, or at a minimum with Adobe's accessibility checker. It is often possible to take an accessible file and convert it into a PDF file that retains those accessibility features, but even so, you still kind of need to check. So that's kind of my warning about PDF accessibility. There are some resources available to you for this. I think it's a little bit more tricky, but it is something that you can try doing if you're interested. And these links are available when you get access to my slides, which will be in just a moment. So I would just really encourage you to think carefully about whether or not you need to share a PDF, but if you're going to, make sure you check it with these features. My recommendation is that given the complications of PDF accessibility, I recommend focusing on creating an accessible document in another file format and then sharing both file formats in the Google Drive space if that's something that you're able to do. So I'm going to just wrap up by saying that, as I said at the beginning, if nothing else, just remember to make sure that you're using your microphone. And that is true whether you're in person or presenting from your own computer virtually. Make sure that you have a good sound setup and it's clear and you've tried to clear out as many background noises as possible and you're near the microphone, because that's really the number one easiest thing you can do to make your presentation more accessible. Here's some links to some additional tools that you may find useful. Cadet's a great tool for creating captions and auto descriptions if you are going to be showing video during your presentation. The rest of these are more general resources about creating accessible content, except for the last one, which is NCDJ's Disability Language Style Guide. If you are going to be talking about disability, this will give you the tools to do it in a way that is accurate and uses up-to-date terminology and not things that might sound out of date or even offensive to people. So if you want to look at any of the links that I've shared or just have access to my presentation, which does have a lot of content in the notes field as well, that tries to sum up what I've said as best as possible, you can do so by going to this bit.ly link. And feel free to review this even beyond what I've said during this presentation. You might find some of the links helpful. And if you have any further questions once you've had a chance to do that, please feel free to get in touch with me either on Twitter, where I'm at Carli Spina, or via email, which is carli.spina@gmail.com.